Donald Trump's threat to obliterate Iran's energy grid if a ceasefire is not reached shortly marks a dangerous tightening of the pressure campaign now unfolding around the war. What matters here is not only the language, which is deliberately maximalist, but the strategic message behind it. Washington is trying to force a decision under the shadow of overwhelming military and economic coercion. To understand this, we need to look at the battlefield, the energy system, and the diplomacy all at once, because each is now feeding the other. At the center of the confrontation is a simple but explosive calculation. The United States is signaling that unless Tehran accepts terms quickly, it may target the infrastructure that keeps Iranian power, water, and oil exports functioning. That is not a marginal threat. It strikes at the core of state capacity. Energy grids, oil wells, export terminals, and desalination facilities are not symbolic assets. They are the systems that sustain civilian life, industrial output, and the government's ability to absorb pressure. When a leader speaks of disabling those systems, the message reaches far beyond military planners. It is meant to shake financial markets, alarm regional capitals, and persuade intermediaries that time is running out. Now, what this reveals is that the conflict is no longer being framed merely as a contest over territory or retaliation. It has become a struggle over coercive leverage. Trump appears to be betting that the threat of crippling infrastructure damage can compel Tehran to negotiate on Washington's terms before the war widens further. That approach, however, carries a severe risk. The more public and totalizing the threat becomes, the less room there is for face-saving compromise. Iran, which has already presented the U.S. proposals as unacceptable, is being pushed to show defiance rather than flexibility, especially if its leaders believe they can survive a prolonged confrontation. Iran's response has been to reject what it describes as unrealistic demands while continuing to show that it can impose costs on Israel and on the wider region. That posture is central to Tehran's strategy. It wants to demonstrate that pressure will not produce capitulation and that any attack on Iranian infrastructure will invite broader retaliation. This is where the situation becomes critical. If one side believes it can destroy the other's strategic assets faster than the other side can retaliate, escalation becomes almost automatic. If both sides believe they can still influence the terms of settlement, diplomacy remains barely alive. Right now, both dynamics are present, which is why the crisis feels so unstable. The Strait of Hormuz is the key geographic pressure point. Roughly a fifth of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas normally passes through that waterway, and any disruption there would immediately ripple through global shipping, insurance, fuel prices, inflation expectations, and industrial supply chains. Trump's warning about reopening the strait was not accidental. It ties the military threat directly to a global economic choke point. In practical terms, the message is that Iran cannot weaponize maritime access without risking a devastating response. In political terms, it tells markets and allies alike that the White House is prepared to treat energy security as a battlefield objective. That is why oil traders have reacted so sharply. Prices are not merely responding to headlines, they are pricing in the possibility that this crisis could widen into a prolonged regional disruption. When energy infrastructure becomes a target and shipping lanes become contested, the market stops thinking about near-term supply and starts thinking about systemic scarcity. This changes behavior across the global economy. Importers hedge more aggressively, refiners pay more, shipping costs rise, and central banks are forced to weigh inflation against slowing growth. A conflict like this does not stay local. It moves quickly into the balance sheets of households, factories, airlines, and governments far from the Gulf. To understand the diplomatic dimension, we need to look at the intermediaries. Pakistan and several regional capitals have been involved in attempts to keep channels open. But the very fact that outside actors are carrying messages shows how limited direct trust has become. Washington says progress is possible. Tehran says the offers are excessive. That gap matters. Peace talks are not only about substance. They are about whether each side believes the other can deliver on a deal and whether any agreement would survive domestic pressure. At the moment, both leaderships are signaling to their own audiences that they will not be bullied. That makes compromise harder, because concessions can be portrayed as weakness. There is also a legal and moral dimension that cannot be ignored. Threatening strikes on power stations and water systems raises immediate concerns under international humanitarian law because those facilities are essential to civilian survival. Even the threat itself changes the diplomatic atmosphere. It invites condemnation from rights groups, unsettles allies, and narrows Washington's room to argue that the campaign is narrowly focused on military necessity. For the United States, this becomes a question not only of force, but of credibility, whether its strategy is seen as disciplined coercion or indiscriminate punishment. That perception will shape how partners in Europe, the Arab world, and Asia respond in the coming days. Now the regional stakes widen further. Gulf states do not want a direct confrontation with Iran that would threaten ports, tankers, infrastructure, or domestic stability. At the same time, they do not want to be seen as enabling an open-ended war that destabilizes the entire neighborhood. They are under pressure to mediate because they are also the ones most exposed to spillover. The same is true for shipping companies, insurers, and energy producers. Every actor connected to the Gulf market is watching for signs that this is a limited coercive episode or the opening phase of a much larger regional conflict. The military logic is equally severe. Once energy infrastructure becomes part of the target set, the line between pressure and war blurs. If the U.S. were to attempt to force outcomes by striking or seizing critical assets, Iran would almost certainly seek asymmetric retaliation. That could include attacks on regional bases, disruption of shipping, missile or drone strikes against allied infrastructure, or pressure on additional transit routes. At that point, the conflict would no longer be about a ceasefire alone. It would become a contest over regional order, maritime access, and the credibility of deterrence. And the longer that contest lasts, the harder it becomes to imagine a clean exit. This is also why the messaging from Washington matters so much. Public threats can be useful in negotiations, but only if they are part of a coherent strategy. Mixed signals can strengthen an adversary's belief that the other side is improvising. If Tehran concludes that the U.S. is divided between diplomacy and escalation, it may wait out the pressure or test the limits of American resolve. If regional partners conclude the same thing, they may seek their own arrangements to protect trade and energy flows. In a crisis of this scale, ambiguity is not neutral. It is interpreted as weakness, hesitation, or strategic drift. The broader geopolitical picture points to a dangerous inflection point. A ceasefire, if it comes, would likely be fragile and heavily conditional. It would probably depend on third-party guarantees, maritime arrangements, and an understanding on energy infrastructure. Even then, the underlying rivalry would remain. If no ceasefire comes soon, the threat architecture itself may become the reality. Markets would likely remain under strain, governments would face renewed inflation pressure, and the Gulf would stay on alert for shocks to shipping and supplies. In that sense, the crisis is already altering behavior, even before any new strike is launched. What makes this moment especially consequential is that it combines military escalation, diplomatic compression, and economic vulnerability all at once. Each element reinforces the others. Threats to infrastructure raise oil prices. Rising oil prices intensify political pressure. Political pressure makes leaders less flexible. Less flexibility raises the risk of further military action. That cycle is what makes the current standoff so difficult to contain. It is not just a confrontation between two states. It is a test of whether coercive diplomacy can still produce restraint once the instruments of pressure begin to damage the global economy itself. There is also a domestic political logic inside both capitals. For Trump, projecting absolute resolve serves a dual purpose. It signals strength to supporters who favor hard power, and it tells adversaries that the White House wants results quickly, rather than a drawn-out negotiation. But that same posture raises the cost of retreat. Once a president has publicly threatened to destroy a rival's energy grid, any later compromise can look like backing down unless it is packaged as a major concession by the other side. In Tehran, the leadership faces a different but equally unforgiving calculation. If it appears to bend under threat, it risks being portrayed at home as vulnerable to external coercion. If it resists too long, it may invite the very strikes it seeks to deter. That is why the ceasefire question is inseparable from prestige. Wars of this kind are not resolved only on the battlefield. They are resolved when each side can tell its domestic audience that its core interests were protected. Iran needs to believe that its sovereignty and strategic deterrent remain intact. Washington needs to believe that it has preserved regional freedom of action, protected allies, and secured the energy corridor. If either side feels it must accept terms under humiliation, the deal becomes unstable from the start. This also explains the intense focus on civilian infrastructure. Energy systems are doubly valuable in a crisis because they are both economic assets and political symbols. They power hospitals, desalination plants, industry, and public services. They also embody the state's ability to function under pressure. When such systems are placed on a targeting list, leaders are no longer only talking about degrading military capability. They are talking about converting structural vulnerability into negotiating leverage. That may be effective in the short term, but it narrows the space for any post-war recovery because it leaves deep scars in the civilian economy. The implications for allies are equally serious. European governments want the war contained because they understand that higher fuel prices, shipping disruptions, and refugee flows would quickly become political problems far beyond the Gulf. India and China, both heavily exposed to Middle Eastern energy supply, would also be forced into contingency planning. The United States may see the threat as a way to compel compliance, but for the wider world it looks like an experiment in using strategic scarcity as a weapon. That perception matters because it can accelerate efforts by other states to diversify supply lines, reduce exposure to the Gulf, and hedge against future crises. At sea, the stakes are even higher. A threatened closure of Hormuz would not have to last long to do damage. Insurance premiums could spike immediately, tanker captains could reroute or delay, and ports across the region would feel the effects. Even rumors of mining, drone attacks, or missile launches can push prices and force governments to deploy additional naval assets. Once militaries begin escorting commercial traffic, the line between deterrence and confrontation becomes thinner. One misread radar signal or one damaged vessel can change the entire trajectory of the crisis. There is, finally, the question of what a realistic endgame would look like. A durable settlement would likely require a narrow but enforceable arrangement, a halt to strikes, a maritime understanding, and guarantees around critical infrastructure. It would also require both sides to step back from public absolutism. That is difficult under current conditions because the rhetoric has hardened so dramatically. Still, that may be the only path that prevents the conflict from spreading further across Lebanon, the Gulf, and the Red Sea environment. Without such a framework, every new threat becomes both a warning and a trigger. This is where the strategic picture turns from alarming to unstable. The United States is trying to force a rapid political result by threatening the systems that keep Iran running. Iran is responding by betting that defiance and regional pressure can outlast American intimidation. Oil markets are reacting by pricing in a broader conflict rather than a temporary crisis. Regional governments are trying to contain the damage while preserving their own security. And hanging over all of it is the reality that civilian infrastructure, once threatened, becomes the center of a contest that is as much about legitimacy as it is about force. The coming hours matter because they will show whether the threat is a bargaining position or the prelude to action. If there is movement toward a ceasefire, it will almost certainly come through intermediaries and under intense pressure to keep the terms narrow. If there is no movement, the rhetoric around Iran's energy system may harden into operational planning. Either outcome will shape not only the battlefield, but also the world economy, the credibility of deterrence, and the stability of the wider Middle East for months to come. Summary of the video. Trump's threat to strike Iran's energy grid has elevated the crisis into a far broader test of coercive diplomacy, legal restraint, and regional stability. The central question now is whether a narrow ceasefire can still be reached before threats against vital infrastructure push the conflict into a more dangerous and far-reaching phase.